The summer heat pressed down on Naples like a heavy blanket, turning the narrow cobblestone streets of the Sanità neighborhood into rivers of shimmering air. The golden Mediterranean light painted everything in warm amber tones, the ochre and terracotta facades of ancient buildings, the red geraniums spilling from iron balconies, the laundry hanging motionless in the still afternoon. Church bells rang in the distance, their sound mixing with the buzz of Vespas weaving through traffic and the passionate voices of neighbors shouting conversations from window to window across the narrow alleys. 8-year-old Lucia Romano stood at the edge of Via dei Cristallini, her small body trembling despite the oppressive heat. Her light brown hair, usually braided neatly by her mother, hung in messy tangles around her pale, freckled face. Tears had carved clean paths through the dust on her cheeks, and her simple floral dress, already worn thin from years of use, was stained with dirt from her desperate journey across the neighborhood. The old sandals on her feet were barely holding together, just like everything else in her life right now. She clutched a crumpled photograph in her small hands, the edges soft from being held too tightly for too long. It showed her mother, Isabella, smiling at the camera, green eyes bright with joy from happier times. That was before the men came, before everything fell apart. Lucia knew she shouldn't be here. Everyone in the neighborhood knew you didn't come to this street unless you had business with Marco Vittori. And children, especially little girls with scraped knees and tear-stained faces, definitely didn't have business with the most dangerous man in Naples. But Lucia was out of options. 3 days ago, men had broken into their tiny apartment above the bakery on Via Vergini. Lucia had been hiding in the closet, peeking through the wooden slats as her mother begged them for more time. "Please," Isabella had pleaded, her voice breaking. "My husband died 2 months ago. I'm working 3 jobs. I just need another week to get the money together." The man with the shaved head and a scar cutting across his scalp had laughed, a cruel, cold sound that made Lucia's stomach turn. "Your husband borrowed 50,000 euros from us, lady. He used it to gamble, and then he was stupid enough to get himself killed before paying it back. That debt doesn't die with him. It transfers to you. But I didn't know about any debt." Isabella's voice had risen in desperation. "Antonio never told me. Not my problem." The scarred man, whose name Lucia later learned was Dante Serra, had grabbed her mother's arm roughly. "You got 72 hours to come up with the money, or we take what's owed another way. We got buyers across the border who pay good money for pretty women." Lucia had pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming as they dragged her mother out of the apartment. She'd waited until their footsteps faded before crawling out, her whole body shaking so hard she could barely stand. For 3 days, Lucia had tried everything. She'd gone to the police station, but the officer at the desk had barely looked at her. "Domestic dispute, kid. Not our jurisdiction." She'd tried to find her mother's friends, but they'd all closed their doors, fear evident in their eyes. Everyone knew Dante Serra. Everyone knew what happened to people who got involved in his business. That's when Lucia remembered the stories. The whispered conversations she'd overheard at the market, the hushed warnings her mother used to give her about staying away from certain streets. Everyone feared Dante Serra and his crew of drug dealers and human traffickers. But there was someone they feared even more. Marco Vittori. The name was spoken with a mixture of terror and respect. He was the man who controlled the real power in Sanità, not through chaos and cruelty like Serra, but through iron-fisted order. People said he was ruthless, that he'd killed men with his bare hands, that he showed no mercy to his enemies. But they also said something else, something that gave Lucia a tiny spark of hope. They said Marco Vittori had a code. They said he didn't hurt women or children. They said that beneath all the violence and power, there was still something human. Lucia had to believe that, because Marco Vittori was her last chance. Now, standing at the entrance to his territory, Lucia watched as 2 large men in expensive suits noticed her. They stood outside what looked like an ancient palace. La Fortezza, people called it. Its weathered stone walls hiding whatever secrets lay within. The men started walking toward her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Lucia's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But she thought of her mother, gentle, hard-working Isabella who sang while making breakfast, who always made sure Lucia ate even when there wasn't enough food for both of them, who worked herself to exhaustion just to keep them in their tiny apartment. She took a step forward. "Hey!" one of the guards called out, his hand moving to his jacket. "Kid, you lost? This ain't a playground." Lucia forced her feet to keep moving, even though her legs felt like they might give out any second. "I need to see Marco Vittori," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. The two men exchanged glances. One of them, the older one with gray hair and sharp blue eyes, stepped forward, his expression softening slightly. "Listen, little one. You need to go home. This isn't a place for children. Please." Lucia's voice cracked. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Please, I need his help. They took my mama. They're going to hurt her. Nobody else will help me. Please." The gray-haired man's jaw tightened. He glanced at his partner, then back at Lucia. Something in her desperate, tear-stained face seemed to affect him. "What's your name, kid?" "Lucia. Lucia Romano. My mama is Isabella Romano. Bad men took her 3 days ago because of money my papa owed before he died. They said—" Her voice broke completely. "They said they're going to sell her if I don't bring them 50,000 euros. I don't have any money. I don't have anyone. Please. Everyone says Signor Vittori is powerful. Maybe he can help, please." The gray-haired man, Giovanni Costa, though Lucia didn't know his name yet, studied her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was respect for her courage. Or maybe he just saw his own daughter in her desperate face. "Wait here," he finally said. He turned to his partner. "Watch her. Don't let her leave." Giovanni disappeared through the heavy wooden doors of La Fortezza. Lucia stood in the hot afternoon sun, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. What if Marco Vittori refused to see her? What if he laughed at her like the police had dismissed her? What if she'd just wasted precious hours that her mother didn't have? 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. Then the door opened again, and Giovanni emerged. His expression was serious. "He'll see you. But kid, be respectful. Don't waste his time. Tell him exactly what happened and then let him decide." Lucia nodded frantically, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. Giovanni led her through the entrance, and Lucia found herself in a different world. The palazzo's interior was stunning. A cool stone courtyard with a fountain bubbling peacefully in the center, ancient frescoes on the walls, afternoon light filtering through arched windows. It smelled of old stone, leather, and expensive cologne. They climbed a staircase to the second floor, Giovanni's hand gently guiding her shoulder. At the end of a corridor, he knocked on a heavy wooden door. "Avanti!" came a deep voice from inside. Giovanni opened the door and nodded at Lucia to enter. She stepped into a large office that looked like something from a movie. Dark wood furniture, leather chairs, shelves lined with old books. Behind a massive desk sat a man who made Lucia's breath catch in her throat. Marco Vittori was younger than she'd expected, maybe as young as her mother, though his eyes looked much older. He was tall even sitting down, with broad shoulders filling out his tailored charcoal suit. His black hair was styled with the sides cut short and the top swept back, and dark, intense eyes studied her with an expression she couldn't read. But what caught her attention were the tattoos. Intricate designs covering both his arms, visible where his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, crawling up his neck and disappearing beneath the fabric. His hands, resting on the desk, were also decorated with ink. He looked dangerous. He looked powerful. He looked like someone who could crush her with one hand. But when he spoke, his voice was controlled, almost gentle. "Come here, Piccola." Lucia's feet moved on their own, carrying her across the room until she stood in front of his desk. She was so small compared to everything in this room, so out of place in her dirty dress and broken sandals. Marco leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Behind him, the window framed a view of Mount Vesuvius in the distance, the volcano that had once destroyed cities now standing peaceful against the summer sky. "Giovanni tells me you have a problem," Marco said. "Tell me what happened. Everything. Don't leave anything out." Lucia's words tumbled out in a rush, about her father's death, about the debt she never knew existed, about Dante Serra and his men breaking into their apartment, about her mother being dragged away with threats of being sold to human traffickers. She told him about going to the police and being turned away, about neighbors too afraid to help, about 3 days of desperate searching that had brought her here, to his door. By the time she finished, she was crying so hard she could barely breathe. She fumbled the crumpled photograph from her pocket and placed it on his desk with shaking hands. "This is my mama. She's good. She works so hard. She didn't do anything wrong. Please, Signor Vittori, please help her. I'll do anything. I'll work for you forever. I'll... Enough." Marco's voice cut through her rambling, but it wasn't harsh. He picked up the photograph, studying it for a long moment. When he looked back at Lucia, something had changed in his expression. Something almost like pain flickered across his face before he masked it again. "You know who I am?" he asked quietly. Lucia nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Everyone says you're dangerous, that you hurt people who cross you. They're right." Marco set the photograph down carefully. "I'm not a good man, Lucia. I've done terrible things. I've hurt people. I've killed people. You understand that?" Lucia nodded again, her whole body trembling. "Then why would you come here?" Marco leaned forward, his tattooed hands folding together on the desk. "Why would you ask a monster for help?" "Because you're the only monster scary enough to fight the other monsters," Lucia whispered. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "And because people say you have rules, that you don't hurt ladies and children, that you keep your word. My mama always told me that even bad people can do good things sometimes. Please, Signor. Please be good this one time. She's all I have." The silence that followed was so heavy, Lucia could feel it pressing down on her chest. Marco stared at her with those intense, dark eyes, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking. Behind her, she heard Giovanni shift his weight, the leather of his shoes creaking softly. Finally, Marco stood. He was even taller than Lucia had thought, towering over her like one of the ancient buildings outside. He walked around the desk, and for a terrifying moment, Lucia thought he was going to tell her to leave. Instead, he crouched down so he was at her eye level. This close, she could see the details of his tattoos, a lion on his chest visible through the open collar of his shirt, Italian words she couldn't quite read winding up his neck, intricate patterns covering his hands. "Dante Serra," Marco said slowly, "is a stain on this neighborhood. He deals in poison, drugs, human trafficking, weapons. He preys on the weak. He has no honor, no code. I've been looking for a reason to remove him from my territory." His eyes held hers. "You just gave me that reason." Hope exploded in Lucia's chest so suddenly it hurt. "You'll help? You'll save my mama?" "I'll get your mother back," Marco said, and something in his voice made it sound like a promise carved in stone. "But Lucia, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to do, it won't be pretty. There will be violence. People will get hurt. I'm going to do things that will give you nightmares." "I don't care." Lucia grabbed his hand without thinking, those dangerous tattooed hands that had done terrible things. "I don't care what you have to do. Just please bring her home. Please." Marco looked down at her small hand clutching his, and for just a second, his mask of control slipped. Something vulnerable flashed across his face, something that looked almost like grief. "Giovanni," he said without looking away from Lucia. "Take her to the guest room. Get her food, clean clothes. Call Maria to look after her." "Marco!" Giovanni's voice carried a note of warning. "You sure about this? Getting involved in Sarah's business? Over a woman and kid you don't know?" Marco stood, gently extracting his hand from Lucia's grip. When he turned to face Giovanni, his expression was cold steel. Sarah took an innocent woman to cover a debt her dead husband owed. He threatened to sell her into slavery, in my territory. His voice dropped lower. He crossed every line we have. This isn't about the woman and the kid. This is about making it clear what happens when someone forgets the rules. Giovanni held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. And if the other families ask questions, let them ask. Marco's jaw tightened. I'm done pretending we're the same as animals like Sarah. There's a difference between doing what's necessary for business and preying on innocent people. It's time everyone remembered that difference. He looked back at Lucia, and his expression softened again. Go with Giovanni. You're safe now. I promise. Lucia wanted to say thank you, wanted to throw her arms around him and sob with relief. But Giovanni was already gently guiding her toward the door. She looked back once and saw Marco standing by the window, his silhouette dark against the fading afternoon light, already making phone calls in rapid Italian she couldn't quite follow. Giovanni led her through winding corridors to a beautiful room with a soft bed, clean linens, and windows overlooking the courtyard fountain. An older woman named Maria appeared shortly after, kind-faced and grandmotherly, bringing pasta with tomato sauce, fresh bread, and cold lemonade. Lucia realized she hadn't eaten in almost 2 days, and she devoured the food while Maria ran her a bath and found clean clothes that were too big but better than her soiled dress. As the sun set over Naples, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Lucia sat at the window and watched shadows grow long in the courtyard below. She heard voices drifting up, Marco giving orders in that controlled, authoritative tone, men responding with crisp acknowledgments. Engines started. Cars pulled out into the narrow street. Somewhere out there in the gathering darkness, the most dangerous man in Naples was going to war. For her. For her mother. For 2 people he'd never met before today. Lucia clutched her mother's photograph to her chest and prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her 8 years of life. The port area of Naples at night was a different world from the historical center. Here, abandoned warehouses cast long shadows under flickering streetlights. The smell of salt water and industrial oil hung heavy in the humid air. In the distance, waves lapped against old docks, and rusted cranes stood like sleeping giants against the starlit sky. Marco sat in the back of a black Mercedes, watching the warehouse that Giovanni's contacts had identified as Dante Serra's current operation base. Beside him, Giovanni checked his weapon one more time, a ritual Marco had seen him perform 1,000 times over the years. You've got 12 men positioned, Giovanni said quietly. Sarah's got maybe 8 inside, plus whoever's guarding the woman. We could take them easy, but Marco... He paused. You know this is going to start a war. Sarah's got connections to the Camorra families up north. They're not going to like you stepping in. Then they shouldn't have partnered with human traffickers, Marco replied, his voice flat. He stared at the warehouse, his mind somewhere else entirely. You remember what it was like, Vanni? Being 8 years old and powerless? Giovanni was quiet for a moment. He'd known Marco since the boy was 12, an orphan living in the streets of Sanità after his parents were killed in a gang shooting. Giovanni had found him bleeding in an alley after a fight with older boys who'd tried to rob him. That starving, desperate child had grown into this, a man who controlled half of Naples' underworld before turning 30. I remember, Giovanni finally said. But Marco, you can't save everyone. You can't undo the past by... I'm not trying to undo anything. Marco's hand unconsciously went to his chest, where beneath the shirt and tattoos, a scar ran across his ribs, a gift from his childhood, from a time when he'd been as powerless as Lucia. I'm just making sure that kid in my office doesn't end up like I did, alone, watching her mother disappear, spending the rest of her life becoming something dark because the world taught her that power is the only thing that matters. He opened the car door. Let's move. What happened next happened fast. Marco's men moved like shadows, surrounding the warehouse with practiced efficiency. When they breached the rusted metal doors, the element of surprise was total. Dante Serra's guards barely had time to reach for their weapons before Marco's crew had them on the ground, zip-tied and neutralized. Marco walked through the chaos with terrifying calm, his expensive shoes echoing on the concrete floor. He found Serra in a back office, scrambling for a gun in his desk drawer. Marco was faster. His hand shot out, slamming the drawer shut on Serra's fingers. The man screamed, "Where is she?" Marco's voice was ice. Serra looked up, recognition and fear flooding his eyes. "Vittori, man, this isn't your business." Marco grabbed him by the throat, lifting him partially off the ground despite Serra being a large man. The veins in Marco's tattooed arms stood out with the effort. "Isabella Romano, where?" "Upstairs," Serra choked out. "Locked room, second floor. Marco, listen, I didn't know she was under your protection." "She wasn't under my protection." Marco's grip tightened. "Until a little girl with more courage than you'll ever have walked into my office and asked me to be better than I am? Where are the papers? The debt documents?" Serra's eyes darted to a filing cabinet. Giovanni was already there, pulling out drawers. He found a folder marked Romano and held it up. Marco dropped Serra, who collapsed to the floor, gasping. "Burn it," he told Giovanni. Then he looked down at Serra with such contempt that the other man actually flinched. "You're done in Naples. You've got 24 hours to liquidate everything and leave. Go north, go south. I don't care. But if I see you in Campania again, if I even hear your name whispered on these streets, I'll make sure what happens to you becomes a story people tell to scare children." "The families won't stand for this," Serra wheezed. "You can't just—" "The families," Marco said coldly, "will understand that there are rules even we don't break. You trafficked an innocent woman to cover a dead man's gambling debt. In my territory. You're lucky I'm letting you walk away with your life." He turned to one of his men. "Make sure he's on a train by tomorrow night. Watch him until he leaves." Then Marco took the stairs 2 at a time to the second floor. He found the locked room Giovanni had mentioned. Flimsy door, cheap padlock, one solid kick and it splintered open. Isabella Romano was curled in the corner of the dark room, her clothes torn, her face bruised, but alive. When the door burst open, she scrambled back, terror in her eyes. "No, please, I already told you I don't have the money." "Signora Romano." Marco kept his voice gentle, staying in the doorway, making himself less threatening. "My name is Marco Vittori. Your daughter came to me. She asked me to find you." Isabella's green eyes, so like Lucia's, went wide. "Lucia? Oh God, is she okay? Where is she?" "She's safe. She's at my home, being looked after." Marco slowly crouched down, the same way he'd done with Lucia earlier. "The men who took you, they're done. The debt is erased. You're free to go." Isabella stared at him like he might disappear if she blinked. "I don't understand. You're Marco Vittori. Why would you— How did Lucia even—" Tears started streaming down her face. "She came to you? She went to a Mafia boss?" "She's 8 years old, and she walked into the most dangerous part of Naples to beg for help from someone she knew could hurt her just as easily as help her." Marco's jaw tightened. "Your daughter is the bravest person I've met in a long time, Signora Romano." "Isabella," she whispered. "Please call me Isabella." Marco stood and extended his hand. "Can you walk?" Isabella took his hand, those tattooed, dangerous hands that had just threatened to kill a man, and let him help her up. Her legs were shaky from 3 days of being locked in the dark with minimal food and water, but she managed to stand. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you. I'll pay you back somehow, I swear. I'll work for you. I'll do whatever you need." "You don't owe me anything," Marco said firmly. "You owe your daughter everything. She's the one who saved you." He wrapped his suit jacket around her shoulders. She was shivering despite the summer heat, and guided her out of the room, down the stairs, past the unconscious guards, and the terrified Serra still on the floor. Giovanni met them at the entrance with a bottle of water, which Isabella drank gratefully. The drive back to La Fortezza was quiet. Isabella sat in the back seat, Marco's jacket still around her shoulders, staring out at the Naples streets sliding past in the darkness. Once, she glanced at Marco sitting beside her and said softly, "Everyone says you're a monster." "They're right," Marco replied without looking at her. "Then why did you help us?" Marco was quiet for a long moment. "Because someone should have helped me when I was Lucia's age." No one did. When they pulled into the courtyard of La Fortezza, Lucia was waiting on the steps with Maria. The moment she saw the car, she started running, her borrowed clothes too big and flapping around her small frame. "Mama! Mama!" Isabella was out of the car before it fully stopped, dropping to her knees just in time to catch her daughter as Lucia threw herself into her arms. They collapsed together on the stone courtyard, both sobbing so hard their whole bodies shook. Marco stood by the car, watching them. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were clenched at his sides, and Giovanni, who knew him better than anyone, saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes looked suddenly distant. "You did good, Marco," Giovanni said quietly beside him. Marco didn't respond. He just watched the mother and daughter clinging to each other like they might never let go. Watched the way Lucia pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and whispered, "I love you," over and over. Watched the way Isabella stroked her daughter's messy hair and promised, "I'm here, baby. I'm here. I'm never leaving you again." Something in his chest hurt. Something he'd thought he'd buried years ago under layers of violence and power and carefully constructed control. Eventually, Isabella looked up at him over Lucia's head. Her green eyes were red from crying, but there was something else in them now, gratitude so profound it was almost painful to see. "Signor Vittori." "Marco," he said. "Just Marco." She stood slowly, Lucia still clinging to her waist, and walked toward him. For a moment, Marco thought she might try to hug him, and he tensed. He didn't know how to handle that kind of genuine affection anymore. But instead, she just took his hand in both of hers. "You gave me back my daughter," she said, her voice steady despite the tears still rolling down her face. "You gave her back her mother. I don't care what people say you are or what you've done. To us, you'll always be the man who saved our family when no one else would." Marco looked down at their joined hands, her small, work-roughened ones wrapped around his tattooed, scarred one. "You should take Lucia home," he said quietly. "Giovanni will drive you. Tomorrow, come back here. I'll have documents prepared showing the debt was satisfied. I'll make sure no one else tries to collect on it." "Will we see you again?" Lucia's small voice piped up. She was looking at him with those big gray-green eyes, and there was something in her expression that made Marco's carefully constructed walls crack just a little bit more. "I don't think that's a good idea, Piccola," Marco said, trying to keep his voice gentle. "You should stay away from men like me." "But you're not like other bad men," Lucia insisted. She pulled away from her mother and walked right up to Marco, tilting her head back to look up at him. "You kept your promise. You saved my mama. That makes you good." "Lucia," Isabella started, reaching for her daughter. "No, Mama." Lucia kept her eyes on Marco. "Signor Marco did a good thing. Good people do good things. That means he's good, at least a little bit. At least when it matters." Marco felt something twist in his chest. He crouched down again so he was at her level, this brave little girl with her stubborn certainty that the world was simpler than it really was. "The world isn't that simple, Lucia." "Maybe it should be," she said. Then, before he could react, she threw her arms around his neck and hugged him. Marco froze. He couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him. Really hugged him. Not as a greeting or an obligation, but as a genuine expression of emotion. Slowly, carefully, like he might break something precious, he brought his arms up and returned the embrace. "Thank you for saving my mama," Lucia whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for being good when it mattered." When she pulled back, Marco's eyes were suspiciously bright. He stood quickly, clearing his throat. Giovanni, take them home. Make sure they get there safely. As he watched the Mercedes pull out of the courtyard with Isabella and Lucia in the back seat, Lucia's face pressed against the window, waving at him until the car turned the corner. Marco felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Hope. Maybe the world wasn't as dark as he'd convinced himself it was. Maybe there was still something worth protecting, something worth being better for. Maybe a little girl's unshakable faith that people could change wasn't as naive as he'd thought. Over the next weeks, something strange happened in the Sanità neighborhood. Marco Vittori, the feared Mafia boss, started showing up at the Romano apartment. At first, it was just to check on them, to make sure no one was bothering them, to ensure Sarah had really left Naples as ordered. But then, it became more. He found himself stopping by on Sunday afternoons, when Isabella made pasta, and the small apartment smelled like garlic and tomatoes and basil. Lucia would run to the door when she heard his knock, her face lighting up like he was something wonderful instead of something dangerous. "Signor Marco, Mama made enough food for an army. You have to stay for dinner." Isabella would roll her eyes at her daughter's lack of subtlety, but smile warmly at Marco. "Lucia's right. We have plenty. Please join us." And Marco, who normally ate alone in his office or grabbed something quick between meetings, would find himself sitting at their tiny kitchen table, watching Isabella move around the small space with practiced efficiency, listening to Lucia chatter about school and friends and the stray cat she was trying to convince her mother to let her keep. It was so normal, so mundane, so completely foreign to everything Marco had known for the past 15 years. "You're different when you're here," Giovanni observed one evening, watching Marco get ready to leave La Fortezza for another Sunday dinner. "You smile. I didn't know you remembered how to do that." Marco looked at himself in the mirror, straightening his collar. He'd started dressing down for these visits, still nice but less intimidating. Fewer visible tattoos, softer colors. He wanted to be less of what he was and more of what Lucia seemed to think he could be. "It's just dinner, Vanni." "It's not just dinner." Giovanni's expression was serious. "You're getting attached. To both of them. And Marco, I'm glad. I am. You deserve some light in your life, but you need to be careful. Your world and theirs don't mix. Eventually, you're going to have to make a choice about what comes next." Marco knew Giovanni was right. But when he arrived at the Romano apartment and Lucia opened the door with flour on her nose because she'd been helping make focaccia, when Isabella smiled at him like he was just a man instead of a monster, when they sat around the table and talked about normal things like Lucia's upcoming school play and the leak in the ceiling they needed to fix, in those moments, the choice seemed obvious. He wanted this. He wanted to be this version of himself, the one who helped fix leaking ceilings and taught 8-year-olds how to play chess, the one Isabella looked at with something almost like affection in her green eyes. "I think we should talk," Isabella said one evening after Lucia had gone to bed. They were sitting on the small balcony overlooking the street, the sounds of Naples at night drifting up around them. "About whatever this is." Marco's hands tightened on his coffee cup. "Isabella!" "No. Let me say this." She turned to face him, her expression serious but not unkind. "I know what you are, Marco. I know what you do. I'm not naive enough to think you're suddenly going to become something else. But I also know that you saved my life. You saved Lucia's future. You've been showing up here week after week, being kind and patient and good with my daughter." She paused. "Why?" Marco was quiet for a long time. The truth felt too vulnerable, too honest. But Isabella deserved honesty, because Lucia looked at me and saw something worth saving. And I want to be that person she thinks I am, even if I don't know how. "You're already being that person," Isabella said softly. "Every time you walk through that door, every time you make my daughter laugh, every time you fix something in our apartment or bring groceries when you think I won't notice, you're being exactly who she thinks you are. I've done terrible things, Isabella. I will have to do terrible things again. My world is violence and power and darkness. You and Lucia, you deserve better than that. Maybe. Isabella reached over and took his hand. But sometimes people don't get what they deserve. Sometimes they get what they need. And maybe we all need each other. Lucia needs a father figure. God knows she hasn't had one since Antonio died, and he wasn't much of one when he was alive. She laughed, a little self-consciously. I need someone who makes me feel safe, who makes me feel like the world isn't completely overwhelming. And maybe you need people who remind you that you're more than what you do in the darkness. Marco looked at her. Really looked at her. She was beautiful in the soft light from the apartment, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her green eyes steady and sure. She wasn't afraid of him. She saw him, all of him, and she wasn't running away. I don't know how to be part of a family, he said quietly. I barely remember what that's like. Then we'll figure it out together. Isabella squeezed his hand. No pressure, no expectations. Just keep showing up, keep being you. Let us be part of your life, and let yourself be part of ours. See what happens. What happened was something Marco had never expected. Slowly, carefully, like building something precious from broken pieces, they became a family. Marco taught Lucia how to play chess, how to speak better Italian alongside her Neapolitan dialect, how to defend herself if someone tried to hurt her. Isabella cooked for him, listened to him talk about the parts of his life he could share, made him laugh with stories about her customers at the cafe where she worked. The neighborhood noticed, of course. People whispered about Marco Vittori's sudden interest in the widow and her daughter. But no one dared to speak against it, not when Marco's protection meant Isabella could walk home from work at night without fear, not when Lucia could play in the streets without worrying about gangs or dealers. 6 months after Lucia had first walked into his office, Marco found himself sitting in a small church in Sanità, watching Lucia play the Virgin Mary in her school's Christmas pageant. Isabella sat beside him, her hand resting comfortably on his arm. Around them, other families filled the pews, normal people living normal lives. And for the first time in 15 years, Marco Vittori felt like he belonged somewhere that mattered. After the play, as they walked home through streets decorated with Christmas lights, Lucia skipped ahead of them, her angel costume wings bobbing with each jump. She turned around, walking backwards, and called out, "Mama! Marco! Hurry up, you're walking too slow." Isabella laughed. "We're coming, tesoro!" Lucia bounded back to them and grabbed both their hands, one in each of hers, swinging between them like children do. "This is the best day ever," she announced. "I got to be Mary, and we're all together, and tomorrow we're going to decorate the tree. It's perfect." Marco looked down at the little girl who had walked into the darkness of his world and pulled him toward the light. Then he looked at Isabella, whose eyes were shining with unshed tears of happiness, and he realized something profound. Lucia had asked him to save her mother, but in the process, she'd saved him too. "Yeah, Piccola," Marco said softly, squeezing her small hand. "It's perfect." Behind them, in the shadows of a narrow alley, Giovanni watched his boss walk away with his new family. He smiled, something warm and genuine, and pulled out his phone to message the other guards. Let them have tonight. No interruptions, no business, just family. Because even monsters, Giovanni thought, deserved a chance at redemption. Especially when that chance came in the form of an 8-year-old girl brave enough to demand it. The lights of Naples sparkled around them as they walked home together, a family built from broken pieces, held together by courage, compassion, and the unshakable belief that people could be better than their worst moments. That sometimes all it took was someone seeing the good in you and refusing to look away until you saw it too. And in a neighborhood where darkness often won, where violence and fear ruled most streets, a little girl's faith had created something beautiful. Something worth protecting, something worth being better for.